The temperature on the morning of December 29th, 1876, was 42 degrees below zero. Not cold in the way people use that word over coffee. Not the cold that makes a man pull his coat tighter or stamp his boots on a porch. This was the other kind. The kind that kills without warning and without apology. The kind that finds every gap in every wall, that turns the moisture in a man's lungs to ice, that drops a healthy person to his knees in 20 minutes and finishes him within the hour. 4 people would die in the Yankton area before that day was over. 2 elderly men whose wood ran out in the second night of the blizzard. A young married couple who stepped outside during a brief lull, lost their bearings in the white, and froze to death 50 yards from their own front door. And an infant 9 months old, whose mother and father had done everything right, and still could not keep a drafty claim shack warm enough for a body that small. The storm had been building for 3 days. The wind did not blow so much as it pressed. A constant, heavy, deliberate force that found the north side of every structure in the river bottomlands and leaned against it like something alive and patient and certain of the outcome. Inside Arvid Ness's timber house, frost had crept a full inch up the interior walls. He had been awake for 36 hours, feeding the stove every 40 minutes. His hands shook. His eyes carried the particular hollowness of a man who has begun to understand that he is losing a fight he was sure he would win. Inside Conrad Felsner's stone house, the finest structure for 20 miles mortared tight by a man who had been a master mason in Hamburg, his 6-year-old daughter slept in her coat and her boots and 2 wool blankets in a room that had not risen above 30 degrees in 2 full days. Inside Reverend Whitmore's white-painted house, the one built to look like it belonged on a village green back in Massachusetts, the Reverend's wife lay shaking from the cold, while her husband knelt and prayed over her in a room that was quietly trying to kill them both. And 3 miles south of all of it, at the base of a long south-facing hillside, a 16-year-old girl named Clara Voss sat at a small wooden table in 64 degrees of steady earth-held warmth, reading by lamplight while the storm screamed 6 feet above her head. She had a cup of coffee. She had cornbread left from the evening before. She had a wool blanket across her lap, not because she needed it, but because it was comfortable. And she had learned in the short weeks since November that comfort is not a thing a person refuses when they have earned it honestly. Outside, the thermometer near her door read 31 below and falling. Inside, the walls held. The timbers held. The earth held. This is the story of how that came to be. And it does not begin on the 29th of December. It begins 43 days earlier on a gray November morning when Clara Voss walked away from everything she had ever known, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dead woman's Bible. Her mother had been gone 6 months when the conversation came. Marta Voss had crossed from central Sweden at the age of 19 alone with a trunk and a name and not much else. She married a man who died of a burst appendix 3 years later, leaving her a small daughter and a quarter section of hard prairie ground. She married again within the year because a woman alone on the frontier with a child was not a woman who could afford to wait for something better to come along. Her second husband was a man named Douglas Hartwell. He was competent, reasonably steady, not cruel in any way the law would recognize. He worked the claim and kept the house and made his decisions the way men made decisions in that time and that place without consultation without explanation, and without any real interest in the thoughts of the women and children who live beneath his roof. Marta understood the arrangement. She accepted it. And in the quiet of it across 12 long years, she watched and she thought, and she prepared for a possibility she never once spoke out loud. She died in May of 1876. Cholera moved through the river settlements that spring and took the weak and the unlucky with the same flat indifference the Dakota winter showed everything else. Marta was 41 years old. She was sick for 6 days. On the 6th day, she was gone. Douglas Hartwell remarried 4 months later. A widow from Sioux Falls named Frances, a practical woman with firm ideas about how a household ought to run, and no patience whatsoever for a stepdaughter who watched everything, said little, and made Frances feel, for reasons she could never quite name, that she was being measured against some standard and found short of it. The conversation came in the last week of October. Douglas sat Clara down at the kitchen table and explained in the tone of a man laying out something perfectly reasonable that an opportunity had presented itself. A man named Horace Beckwith, 47 years old, recently widowed, farming a claim outside Sioux Falls, was looking for a wife. He was established. He had a real house with real floors. He could provide. Clara was 16 years old. She sat very still and she listened to every word. She asked one question. What happened if she said no? Douglas looked at his wife and then back at his stepdaughter. If she would not contribute to the household through a marriage, he said, then she would need to contribute through labor. And Frances had made it clear there was no room in the household for that. Clara stood up. She walked to her small room. She put on her coat and her boots, and she picked up the one thing in that house that belonged wholly and only to her. Her mother's Bible, a battered Swedish edition with a cracked spine and pressed flowers tucked between certain pages, flowers her mother had gathered from fields in 3 different countries across the span of a hard life. She walked out the front door at 9:30 in the morning. Douglas Hartwell called after her once. She did not turn around. She walked 2 miles before she stopped. She found a place behind a stand of cottonwoods that broke the wind, and she sat down on a fallen branch, and she opened her mother's Bible for the first time since the funeral. She had been avoiding it, the weight of it, the closeness of touching a thing her mother's hands had touched every single day for 20 years. The pressed flowers fell out first. Cornflowers from Sweden, prairie asters from somewhere along the wagon road west, a dried sprig of something Clara could not name. Then the money, folded into small, tight squares tucked between the pages of Proverbs and Psalms and the Book of Ruth. Bills and coins, not a fortune, but far more than Clara had ever imagined her mother possessed. $280 saved penny by careful penny across years' egg money. The sale of preserves, small quiet transactions never once mentioned at the supper table, adding up over time to something that looked in that moment behind the cottonwoods like a plan. Clara stared at it a long while. Then she turned to the back of the Bible, to the blank pages most editions leave after the book of Revelation, and she found her mother's handwriting. Marta Voss had never been a schooled woman. Her letters were large and a little uneven, and they mixed Swedish words in among the English the way a person writes when they are writing quickly and privately, and for no eyes but one. But the content of those pages was anything but uneven. It was precise. It was patient. It was the work of years. 14 pages of notes on how to build a home into the earth. Sources noted in the margins. A French trapper who had wintered in a dugout for 20 years up on the James River and was still alive at 73, with no consumption and no rheumatism to show for it. Descriptions copied from a German farming journal. Notes taken from watching the native traders who still passed through the settlements, who spoke of the earth lodges their families had lived in before the treaties pushed them west. Warm in winter, cool in summer, built from materials that cost nothing but labor. And then Marta's own observations gathered quietly over a decade of watching her neighbors build their houses and watching those houses fail. The notes covered everything: which way the hill must face, how deep to dig, the secret of 2 walls with a gap of dead air held still between them, the angle of the roof and how to spread the weight of it, the slope of the floor so the water would run away on its own, where to set the chimney so the draft would pull without coaxing, how much wood a winter would truly take, how the temperature underground does not chase the temperature of the air, but holds steady all the year round. And at the very end, in handwriting that was different from the rest, slower, more careful, the hand of a woman who knew she was running short of time. There were 3 lines. If you are reading this, things have gone as I feared. Do not go back. Do not take what they offer you. The earth will hold you. I tested this myself. Clara sat behind those cottonwood trees for a very long time. When at last she stood up, she was no longer a girl who had been thrown out of a house. She was a girl with a direction and a plan, and $253 left after the cost of a winter's food, and the full and complete confidence of a dead woman who had loved her enough to spend 12 years getting ready for the worst day of her daughter's life. She filed for a homestead 3 days later at the land office in Yankton under the name C. Voss. The clerk looked up at her for a moment. He started to ask a question. Then he looked back down at the paperwork and thought better of it and stamped the page. 160 acres. A quarter section with a south-facing hillside 3 miles south of town, looking down over the Missouri River bottomlands. She had chosen it the afternoon before. She had ridden out along the river slowly on a borrowed horse, studying the slopes and the elevations, and the way the land lay against the low winter sun. And what she had seen had told her almost everything she needed to know about the people who lived there. Most of the settled claims sat on flat open ground. Practical ground to a certain way of thinking. The kind of ground that made sense to men who were used to building tall timber houses that stood up straight and faced the road and announced themselves to the world. Some families had built houses of sod instead, but they had built them the way they would have built anything else. 4 walls standing free and proud in the open wind, trying to hold back a Dakota winter through sheer stubbornness and mass. Clara's hillside faced south. It had a long, gentle slope running down toward a dry creek bed. It had the body of the hill itself standing guard on the north side, where the killing wind came down out of Canada. It sat a little lower than the surrounding plain, and so it was a little less exposed. And at the base of the slope there was a shallow, natural hollow just deep enough to set an entrance into without a great deal of extra digging. Her mother's notes had been firm about this. South-facing. Always south-facing. The angle of the winter sun matters. The shelter of the hill matters more. Clara stood on that hillside for 20 minutes in the cold November wind, turning slowly, reading the land the way her mother had taught her to read all things, not for what it appeared to be, but for what it would actually do when the weather came. Then she drove her first stake into the half-frozen ground, and she went to find men to dig. Burke and Stellan Jurgensen were the sons of a Norwegian family with too many children, and not enough land, which was a common arithmetic out there, where the promise of homesteading rarely added up the way the pamphlets had said it would. Burke was 17. Stellan was 15. They were big for their ages, willing and badly in need of coin. Clara found them outside the general store in Yankton. She named the job and named the wage, 50 cents a day each. And the brothers looked at one another and looked at the silver in her hand and took it. Stellan would say many years later that he spent the first 3 days of that job convinced that Clara Voss had lost her mind. They were cutting into a hillside, digging down, not building up, 8 feet back into the slope, 3 feet deeper than the surrounding grade, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, 9 feet of headroom at the front where the entrance would open south toward the low winter light. Stellan kept waiting for someone to explain what in God's name they were building. Clara explained nothing that did not need explaining. She showed him where to cut and how deep and at what angle. And when he did it wrong, she showed him again without sighing, without rolling her eyes, without the smallest trace of the contempt that most grown men had shown a Norwegian farm boy his whole short life. She simply showed him again, as though it were the most natural thing in the world that a person should need to be shown a thing twice. It was, Stellan would say later, more respect than he had been paid by anyone ever. The earth they dug out did not go to waste. Dakota sod was a remarkable material, dense, fibrous, bound together by the root systems of bluestem and buffalo grass that had been weaving themselves through that soil since before any white man had ever set eyes on it. You could cut a brick of it and stand on the brick and it would not crumble. They cut 247 bricks, each one 36 inches long, 12 inches wide, 6 inches thick, 45 pounds apiece. By the end of the first week, Burke and Stellan could barely lift their arms above their heads. The bricks built the front wall 28 inches thick at the base, tapering to 20 inches at the top. And behind that wall a gap, 2 full feet of empty space. And behind the gap, a second wall 12 inches thick. That gap was the heart of the whole design, though a man could have walked past it 100 times and never understood why it mattered. The 2 feet of still trapped air between those walls would do more work against the cold than 4 feet of solid earth ever could. Air that cannot move is one of the poorest conductors of heat in all of nature. Clara's mother had understood that, without ever knowing the word for it, and she had written it down. And now her daughter was building it into a Dakota hillside, while 2 Norwegian boys hauled sod and wondered if they were being paid to assist a lunatic. 6 lodgepole pine timbers carried the roof, 8 inches across, set 30 inches apart. They came down from the Black Hills, freighted in at real expense, very nearly half of everything Clara intended to spend. But she had read her mother's notes closely, and she understood that a roof was not a place to save money. A roof that failed would not merely cost her comfort. It would cost her everything all at once in the middle of the night under 4 feet of frozen sod. She did not economize on the timbers. Across the timbers went a lattice of willow branches, and across the willow a layer of canvas, and across the canvas 2 courses of sod, 14 inches thick, close to 3 tons of earth resting overhead. The timbers did not so much as creak. The roof itself was angled 2 inches of fall for every foot of run sloping down from back to front so the snow and the rain would shed and never pool. And the back 3/4 of the whole structure sat tucked beneath 4 feet of undisturbed hillside, invisible from above a great silent mass of earth that would hold its temperature like a stone held in a closed fist. In the back corner sat a small cast-iron stove. Its pipe did not run straight up. It ran at an angle of 30 degrees back into the hill through a tunnel 9 feet long that Clara had lined with clay before it finally broke the surface 12 feet above the roofline. The angle gave the smoke its natural draw, so the fire pulled clean without any coaxing, and the clay around the pipe soaked up the heat of the smoke as it passed and gave that heat slowly back to the earth, and the earth gave it slowly back to the room. Nothing was burned that did not earn its keep twice over before it left. 2 windows set deep into the thick front wall, where the depth of the sod made small wells that gathered what light the short days offered. A door of cottonwood plank, 4 inches thick, hung on leather hinges from the fort built to open inward, so that no drift of snow could ever seal her inside. A floor of packed earth mixed with water and wood ash and tamped down hard and swept smooth with fine sand. A floor that would never rot, never warp, and never cost her a cent. The total cost of the materials when Clara added the column of figures one evening by lamplight was $27. Her mother had left her $280. She had spent 27 of it on the walls and the roof and the door of her home. The rest she kept for food, for kerosene, for the long, slow work of proving up a claim, and for a future she was building one careful decision at a time. They came on the 3rd day of the work. Not together. They came one at a time, each man arriving as though the notion had occurred to him alone, as though no one had said a word to anyone. But Clara had seen the 3 of them standing together outside the general store earlier that week, heads bent, talking low. And she had her own ideas about how independent their independent visits truly were. Arvid Ness came first. He was 42 years old, a thick-chested man with hands that had been built by 30 years of hard labor, and a beard he had not troubled to trim since he left Minnesota 3 winters back. He had lost his first house to a prairie fire. He had watched his second collapse under the weight of a heavy snow. He was living now in his third. A sound timber frame that had cost him $400 in lumber freighted up from Sioux City, and another $100 in hired labor. He was proud of that house. He was also, though he would have bitten through his own tongue before admitting it to a living soul cold in it. He rode up on a gray horse, swung down, and stood looking at Clara's excavation, with the expression of a man watching someone make a mistake he recognized, but had not been invited to prevent. "You want to build here," he said. Norwegian accented English, every sentence tipped up at the end toward a question. "Yes," Clara said. "Into the hill. 8 feet back, 3 feet down." Arvid took off his hat and scratched the back of his head and looked the whole thing over. The cut earth, the first courses of the wall, the 2 Jorgensen boys hauling sod with the grim energy of the young and the underpaid. "The earth," he said, slow and careful. the way a man speaks when he is sure he is right, and only deciding how gently to say it. It will collapse, all that weight on the roof. It will come down and crush whatever is underneath. "I'll carry the roof on timbers," Clara said, "and the angle will shed the weight before it can gather. Timbers cost money. I know what they cost." He studied her a moment longer. There was something in her stillness that troubled him, though he could not have put a name to it. She was not frightened. She was not arguing. She was simply standing there, present and unbothered in the particular way that people are present when they know a thing you do not. "The cold air," he said. "It sinks. You dig a hole, you make a place for all the cold in Dakota to come and settle. You will freeze down there like a potato in a root cellar. The ground stays warmer than the air all winter long," Clara said. "Root vegetables don't freeze in a cellar because the earth around them doesn't freeze. It's the same principle. I'm only borrowing it." Arvid laughed, not unkindly. It was the laugh of a man humoring a child who has said something clever without understanding why it is wrong. "This is Dakota, girl," he said. "Everything here is cold. The ground is cold. You need thick walls and a good stove and more wood than you think. That is what everyone needs. Building down into the dirt that is for turnips, not for people." He put his hat back on. He climbed onto his gray horse, and he rode away, shaking his head the whole way down the slope. Clara watched him go, and then she turned around and went back to work. Conrad Felsner came that same afternoon. He was a different sort of man entirely. Where Arvid led with his size and his years, Conrad led with precision. He had been a master mason in Hamburg before he ever crossed the water, and he carried that knowledge the way an old soldier carries a medal, as proof of something earned at great cost, which the world was therefore obligated to respect. His stone house was, by common agreement, the finest building within 20 miles, mortared tight, square and true. It had cost him 8 months of his own labor, and $370 besides, and he considered it with some justice a monument to everything a man could accomplish through skill and discipline, and refusal to cut a single corner. He came on foot because his claim was near. He walked the perimeter of Clara's excavation slowly, with his hands clasped behind his back, the way a building inspector might walk a site he has already decided to condemn. "Underground," he said at last. His English was clipped and exact, every word set down like a brick in a course. "Everything underground is wet. You will have damp. You will have mold growing on the walls. Your clothing will rot on your back. Your food will spoil before you can eat it. And your lungs." He stopped and he looked at her directly for the first time. "My cousin," he said, "in Pennsylvania. He tried this same foolishness. A house dug into a bank. His wife was dead of consumption inside of 2 years. The damp got into her chest, and it never came out again." "I'll ventilate it," Clara said. "And I've graded the floor so the water runs away from the living space, out toward the entrance and into the ground." "You have graded the floor?" Conrad came very close to smiling. "With what tools? With what training? You are, what, 15 years old? 16. 16. And you know how to set a grade for drainage. You know how to calculate a pitch so fine the eye cannot see it, but the water can still find it." He shook his head slowly. I served 4 years as an apprentice to learn that. 4 years under a master who struck my knuckles with a rule when I got it wrong. I'll figure it out." He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just announced with perfect calm that they intend to fly. It was not cruelty in his face. It was something closer to grief, the grief of a craftsman watching good effort poured into certain failure. "Pride," he said, "comes before the fall. But you are young, and the young must learn by falling. When you are cold enough and wet enough and frightened enough, come to my house. There is room by the stove. We will not turn you away." And he too walked off down the slope, and Clara watched him go, and then she picked up a length of twine and checked her floor grade one more time, because a thing worth doing once was worth checking twice. And because a small, hard part of her wanted the satisfaction of knowing, even if no one else would ever know it, that the German mason was wrong, and that her floor was true. It was. The third man did not come to inspect. He came to disapprove. Reverend Whitmore was 48 years old, a Boston man by birth and by bearing who had come west to bring what he called civilization to the frontier, which in practice meant holding a church service in his front parlor every Sunday morning and explaining at considerable length how things were properly done back in the world he had left behind. He had built himself a respectable, white-painted clapboard house that would not have looked out of place on a New England village green. It did not seem to concern him in the least that the nearest tree stood 3 miles off, or that the wind came across that open prairie and struck his fine painted walls like a closed fist day and night all winter long. He arrived at the edge of Clara's claim and stood there with his hands behind his back, and he did not step 1 foot onto the worked ground. "Miss Voss," he said, "I understand your circumstances are difficult. I sympathize. Truly I do. But this." He lifted one hand toward the excavation, the half-built wall, the dark mouth of the dugout opening into the hill. "This is not appropriate." "What isn't, sir?" Clara said. She had learned by then not to offer more words than a question required. A young woman, living alone, in a hole dug into the ground. He said the word hole the way another man might say grave. "What will people say? What will they think of you? They will think you are no better than a savage. They will think you have turned your back on Christian society altogether. A proper home, Miss Voss, has walls that stand above the ground, and windows that face the road, and a door that opens to the world. It announces to every passerby that decent, civilized people dwell within. This," he gestured again, "this announces nothing but desperation." "Maybe I am desperate," Clara said. And for just a moment, something in the Reverend softened. "There are better paths," he said more gently now. "The church can help you find a respectable placement. You are young and you are clearly capable. A good family would be glad to take you on as help. And in good time, a suitable marriage might be arranged. A proper one, to a steady man." "I filed a homestead claim," Clara said. "It's legal. I mean to prove it up." And the softness went out of him as quickly as it had come. "Prove it up." He almost laughed, but there was no warmth in it. 5 years, Miss Voss. You believe you will last 5 years in a dirt hole on the open prairie. The Homestead Act was written for families. for men with capital and strong backs and wives to keep them. It was not written for. He caught himself, drew a breath, and finished more carefully than he had begun. The law may permit what you are doing, but nature will not. You will be gone by spring, and some more suitable claimant will take this ground and put it to its proper use. He turned and he walked away, and unlike the other two, he did not look back even once. He had said his piece. In his own mind, the matter was settled. Clara stood in the cold and watched the white-painted figure dwindle down the road toward town. Then she went back to work, because the wall would not build itself and the days were getting short, and the only opinion on that hillside that had ever truly mattered to her had already been written down in the back of a Bible in a slow and careful hand by a woman who was no longer there to defend her. Here is the thing that none of the three men knew, the thing that would have changed every word they said had they known it. Clara Voss had not come to that hillside to gamble. She had not arrived frightened and ignorant to throw herself on the mercy of luck and the prairie. She had come with a plan that was years in the making, and she had come with proof. Because for the whole of the last year, through every trip she had made at her stepfather's side, hauling grain and trading goods up and down the river, settlements Clara had been watching, and she had been remembering. And in a small notebook she kept hidden at the bottom of her trunk, she had been writing it all down. She had watched Arvid Ness's house lose its boards to an autumn gale, watched him climb up in the wind to nail them back on, watched him do it again the next month, and the month after that. A house that fought the wind, she had written, will lose to the wind eventually. The wind has more time than any man. She had watched the windows of Conrad Felsner's beautiful stone house weep with moisture. Every cold morning watched the dense, cold stone draw the warmth out of the indoor air, until every bit of moisture in it gathered and ran down the inside of those proud square walls in long gray streaks. Stone is honest, she had written, but it is not warm. Stone takes heat. It does not give it back. And she had watched Reverend Whitmore's woodpile through the early winter, watched it shrink week by week, far faster than the calendar said it should, until he was sending to town for more before December was even half gone, and paying a premium for it besides. A house that stands in the open, she had written, is a fire trying to warm the whole prairie, and the prairie always wins. So when Arvid told her the cold would sink and find her, she had her answer ready, though she chose not to give it, that the cold could only find what was exposed to it, and that she did not intend to be exposed. When Conrad warned her of damp and mold and a rotting chest, she had her answer ready, that his cousin's house had surely had no grade and no ventilation, and that she had built in both. And when the Reverend told her that nature would not permit what she was attempting, she had the truest answer of all the ones she had read 100 times in the back of her mother's Bible, and she did not give that one either. The earth will hold you. I tested this myself. She did not argue with any of them. Arguing changed no minds. She had learned that much watching her mother across 12 silent years. Only the thing itself would change minds. Only the wall and the roof and the long Dakota winter and the dugout that would either hold or fail. And so she said little, and she built much, and she let the three men ride and walk away, believing they had warned a foolish child of her doom. She was not experimenting. She was not guessing. She was the second link in a chain her mother had forged in secret out of the borrowed wisdom of a French trapper and a German journal, and the displaced people who had wintered warm in the earth of that very country, long before any of these men had arrived to freeze on top of it. She was synthesizing. She was finishing a thing that had been started for her with love, by a woman who had known exactly what kind of winter was coming for her daughter, and exactly how to survive it. The fourth man was the only one who came to understand, rather than to judge. And he came near the end of the building after the roof was on, and the door was hung when the dugout had begun to look less like a wound in the hillside, and more like a home. His name was Ezra Winthrop. He was 30 years old, a school teacher from Wisconsin, who had taken a claim of his own to supplement the thin pay of a frontier teacher. He had studied natural philosophy at a college back east, which meant, and this set him apart from nearly every other man in the county, that he was in the genuine habit of asking how a thing worked, rather than simply repeating what his father had told him about it. He came up the slope on foot with a leather notebook under one arm and a stub of pencil behind his ear, and he did not say a word for a long time. He walked the perimeter the way Conrad had. But where Conrad had walked looking for what was wrong, Ezra walked looking for what was true. He crouched and studied the slope of the floor. He stood back and judged the pitch of the roof against the line of the hill. He laid his palm flat against the thick sod of the front wall and held it there, and his eyebrows rose by a fraction of an inch. "You've built it into the thermal mass of the hill," he said at last, half to himself. Clara looked at him. It was the first thing any visitor had said that was neither a warning nor a sentence of doom. "The earth this far down holds its heat," Ezra went on, still mostly to himself, turning slowly to take in the whole of it. "It doesn't chase the air. It can't, there's too much of it. And it's too slow to change. 6 feet down, in the dead of this coming winter, that ground is sitting at somewhere near 50 degrees. And come July, in the worst heat of summer, it will be sitting at the very same 50 degrees. He shook his head slowly. "You haven't built a house. You've built a battery. A great earthen battery holding steady at 50 degrees all the year round. You only have to add a little heat in the winter and let a little out in the summer, and you'll live in comfort while the rest of us are out there trying to warm the open air inside a wooden box that leaks heat from every seam." He turned and looked at her directly then, and there was something new in his face. Not the warmth of charity, and not the chill of disapproval. Something closer to respect, offered between equals. "Did someone teach you this?" he asked. Clara thought of the back pages of her mother's Bible, of the slow, careful hand, of the 3 lines written by a woman who was running out of time. "My mother," she said. It was the most she had told anyone. Ezra nodded slowly as though that explained a great deal. "There's a man in Germany," he said. "A scientist. Helmholtz. He has been writing for years now about the conservation of energy, about how heat moves and why and where it goes. He glanced around the dim earth-walled space, warm even now with only a small fire banked in the corner stove. You've built a working demonstration of his theories with your own 2 hands. And you don't even know his name." "Will it keep me alive?" Clara asked. Of all the questions she might have asked, it was the only one that mattered to her. Ezra was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, he did her the honor of telling her the whole truth and not the comfortable part of it. "If you manage the moisture and you keep the air moving, then yes, I believe it will. I believe it will work beautifully." He paused. But understand me, there is still risk in it. If that chimney ever chokes, the bad air will gather and you will not wake up. If your drainage fails in a thaw, you'll be living in a swamp inside a week. If one of those roof timbers ever cracks under the load, it will not give you any warning at all. And if you fall ill alone, you are 3 miles from the nearest soul who might help you. I'll be careful, Clara said. Careful is not always enough, Ezra said, and he said it gently, but he said it plainly. Nature does not care about your intentions. It does not grade on effort. He tucked his notebook back under his arm. But I hope you make it. I hope it with everything in me. Because if you do, if you come through this winter alive and warm in this hillside, then you will have proven something that a great many people out here very badly need to learn. And that Miss Voss would be worth more than your survival alone. He did not promise to help. He did not offer her a place by his stove. He offered her something she valued far more, though neither of them said. So out loud, he took her seriously. He treated the work of her hands as a thing worth measuring, worth understanding, worth writing down. Then he walked back down the hill, and Clara stood alone at the door of the home her mother had designed, and she had built. And for the first time since that gray morning behind the cottonwoods, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was very close to it. She moved in on the 4th of December. The first night she lit no fire at all. She wanted to know the truth of the thing unhelped before she trusted her life to it. She wanted to know what the earth would do on its own. She sat at her small table wrapped in her mother's wool shawl, and she watched the small thermometer Ezra had loaned her, and she waited. The air outside went down past 20 degrees as the dark came on. The wind picked up across the prairie above her head and moaned along the top of the hill. And inside the dugout, with no flame burning anywhere, the needle of the thermometer settled and held and did not move. 51 degrees. No fire, no fuel burned, no wood spent. Just the long, patient warmth of the earth itself held in the great mass of the hill and given back slow and steady and free to the girl who had known enough to dig down into it. 51 degrees while the prairie froze above her. Clara Voss sat in the lamplight a long while looking at that unmoving needle. Then she reached across the table and drew her mother's Bible toward her. And she opened it to the back, to the pages of careful, slanting hand, and she read the last 3 lines once more, the way another person might say a prayer before sleep. The earth will hold you. I tested this myself. She closed the book. She turned down the lamp, and in the dark of her dugout, in 51 degrees of warmth, that had cost her nothing but the wit to understand it, Clara Voss lay down on her rope bed and slept the whole night through, while 3 miles north the established men of the settlement fed their stoves against the cold, and never once imagined that somewhere out in the dark, a 16-year-old girl had already won an argument they did not yet know they had lost. The hard part of the winter had not yet come. The cold she had survived that night was nothing a mild night and easy test. The real test was still weeks away, gathering somewhere up over the plains of Canada, building its strength in silence. But the foundation was laid now, in every sense that mattered, and the earth was holding. The first true cold came on the 15th of December. It arrived the way the worst things on the prairie always arrived, without announcement, without mercy and without any regard for whether a person was ready. The morning broke clear and hard, and brittle the sky a pale washed blue that held no comfort in it at all. By the time the sun was fully up, the thermometer near Clara's door read 6 degrees below zero. By noon it had not climbed, and as the short day folded back down into dark, the cold settled in over the river bottomlands and made itself at home, and it stayed for 3 days and 3 nights without easing once. This was the cold that separated the prepared from the hopeful. This was the cold that tested every wall and every roof and every plan that men had made in the easy days of autumn, when winter was still a rumor. In the timber house 3 miles north, Arvid Ness was losing. He did not think of it that way, not yet. A proud man does not let himself think the word losing until the thing is nearly done. But the evidence was piling up around him the way the snow was piling against his north wall, and some quiet part of him had begun to read it. He was burning a cord of wood every 4 days. He had built his woodpile to last the winter, and now doing the arithmetic in the cold gray light of the second morning, he understood that it would not. He was rising 3 times in the night to feed the stove, and the third time, always near 4 in the morning, he would stand in his own front room in the dark, with the fire roaring, and still feel the cold pressing in against his back from the walls behind him. Frost grew on the inside of the boards. His children slept in their coats, and every dawn he looked at the dwindling stack of split wood by the door and felt the first thin edge of a fear he would not name. In the stone house, Conrad Felsner was losing in his own way. His beautiful, square, true-built walls drew the warmth out of every room as fast as the stove could put it in. The cold stone did exactly what cold stone does. It took and gave back nothing. His youngest daughter had developed a cough that worried him more than he let his wife see. The dense walls that he had laid with his own master's hands, the walls he had been so proud of, were proven to be the very thing that was freezing his family. And a craftsman's pride is a hard and heavy thing to set down. And 3 miles south in a hillside, that the 3 established men of the settlement had agreed in low voices outside the general store, would be the death of a foolish girl. By January, Clara Voss woke each of those 3 brutal mornings to a dugout that held at 58 degrees with no fire burning in it at all. She would rise from her rope bed in that steady earth-given warmth, and she would build a small fire in the corner stove, and within the hour, the room would climb to 65, and that warmth would hold for the rest of the day with only the smallest feeding. She burned 6 pounds of wood, not a cord every 4 days, 6 pounds a day. Her 2 cords, stacked neat and dry inside the entrance, were going to last her the whole of the winter with a great deal to spare. And she had known they would because her mother had written the number down, and her mother had been right. On the 3rd morning of the cold snap, Arvid Ness rode south. He did not entirely know why he was doing it. He told himself he was checking on the girl, the way a decent man checks on a neighbor in hard weather. That was part of it, and it was true. But it was not all of it. Some part of him needed to see her fail to confirm the verdict he had pronounced to set his own freezing house against the certainty that hers was worse. And some other part of him deeper down and quieter had begun to suspect that the opposite might be true, and that part of him could not rest until it knew. He found her outside in the cold, in the gray morning light, splitting kindling in nothing but a wool sweater. He sat his gray horse a moment and watched her. She was not hunched against the cold. She was not hurrying. She worked at an even, unbothered pace, her breath clouding in the air, and she looked of all the impossible things comfortable. "How much wood are you burning?" he said. No greeting. The question had been riding him the whole 3 miles, and it came out first. "About 6 pounds a day," Clara said. She set another length up on the block and split it clean. Arvid was quiet for a moment. "That is not possible." "It's what I'm using." He looked past her up the slope to the thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney at the top of the hill. It was barely there at all, a pale wisp against the hard blue sky. His own chimney 3 miles north was pouring smoke like a forge, in full blast, hour after hour, day and night. "The cold is getting through somewhere," he said. "It has to be. You cannot heat a place on 6 pounds of wood in this. Nobody can." "It isn't getting through," Clara said. She buried the axe in the block and straightened up and looked at him plain and direct, without challenge in it, and without apology either. "Come inside. See for yourself." And there it was. The thing Arvid Ness had ridden 3 miles to avoid, and 3 miles to discover both at once. He hesitated. He had spent 2 weeks telling every man who would listen that this girl would freeze, that she had buried herself alive, that they would be digging her body out of that hill come February. To walk through that low door now was to walk into the possibility of his own foolishness. A proud man feels the weight of a thing like that, the way another man feels the cold. But he had not ridden 3 miles to turn back at the threshold. He swung down off the horse and he ducked his head, and he stepped through the cottonwood door into the hill. The warmth met him at the door like a hand laid flat against his chest. It was not the warmth he knew. It was not the fierce, dry, roaring heat of a stove fed hard against a losing fight. The heat that scorches your face while your back goes cold. This was something else entirely. A gentle, even encompassing warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and from nowhere at all. The walls were warm. The floor was warm. The very air was warm. And it was all the same warmth, all one temperature, with no cold corner anywhere, and no draft cutting across the room, and no place where the heat gathered and no place where it failed. It was Arvid would think later, riding home like standing inside something living. "God in heaven," he said. He had not meant to say anything. "It is warmer in here than in my house." "The earth holds the heat," Clara said. "I just keep it. I'm not making warmth and fighting to hold on to it. I'm only adding a little to what's already here." He walked to the back wall. He laid his big, scarred palm flat against the sod, the way Ezra Winthrop had done weeks before, and he felt it not cold, not damp, but faintly warm, like the skin of a sleeping animal. He looked up at the roof, at the solid timbers, at the great mass of sod above them. He looked down at the floor and walked a slow line across it, and could not even feel the grade his own neighbor, the German mason, had sworn no untrained girl could ever set. And then Arvid Ness did a thing that did not come easily to a man like him. "I was wrong," he said, quietly. He did not look at her when he said it. He said it to the wall, to the room, to the warmth. "I told everyone it would not work. I was wrong." "You couldn't have known," Clara said. "No, He shook his head slowly, and now he did turn and look at her. No, I should have known. My grandfather in Norway. He built into the hillsides the old way. I remember it from when I was a boy visiting him in the winter and how warm it was in his house when it should not have been. His voice had gone rough. I should have remembered. We come to a new country and we think we are clever because we have new tools and sawn lumber and money to spend. And we forget everything our grandfathers knew, everything they learned the hard way so that we would not have to. He stood a moment longer in the warmth, an old, hard, weather-beaten man humbled by a hillside and a 16-year-old girl. Then he went out back into the killing cold, and he climbed onto his gray horse, and he rode home to his freezing timber house. He did not tell a soul what he had seen. Pride is a stubborn thing, stronger sometimes than cold, stronger sometimes than sense. But from that day forward, Arvid Ness never again predicted that Clara Voss would fail. And a man who has stopped predicting your failure has, whether he admits it or not, begun to believe in you. Ezra Winthrop returned 3 days after the cold broke, when the weather had eased back to something a person could move through without dying in it. He did not come the way Arvid had come, half hoping for proof of doom. And he did not come the way Conrad had come, looking for the flaw. He came the way he did everything, with his leather notebook under his arm and a stub of pencil behind his ear, and a mind that wanted more than anything to understand. But when he sat down at her small table that morning, what he said was not what Clara had expected. "I should be honest with you about why I keep coming out here," Ezra said. He turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "It isn't only to help. I want you to understand that. I'm not certain I've helped you at all." Clara waited. She had learned the value of letting a man finish. "What you've built here is interesting to me. More than interesting." He looked around the warm, dim room, at the walls, at the angled chimney, at the timbers overhead. "It's the most interesting thing I've seen since I came west. And the truth of it, Miss Voss, the truth I owe you is that I keep coming back here, at least partly, because I want to be the one who records what happens. Whatever happens." He met her eyes, whether it works or whether it doesn't. It was a hard thing to say, and he said it plainly, and Clara respected him for both. "You think it won't?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I think it might not. That's a different thing." Ezra set down his cup, and then, because he was a teacher, and because a teacher cannot help but lay out a problem in its full shape once he has started, he laid it out for her, one piece at a time, the way her mother had laid out the building of it. "4 things can kill you down here," he said. "I've thought about all of them, and you should think about them too, because I'd rather frighten you in December than mourn you in February." He held up one finger. "The chimney. If it ever blocks ice soot, a bird's nest in the spring, a clump of frozen clay come loose in the tunnel. The bad air gathers. There's no draft to carry it out, and you're sealed in the earth. It won't smell like anything. It won't wake you. You simply won't wake up at all." A second finger. "The drainage. You've graded it well, I'll grant you that, better than the German would believe. But a hard thaw or a spring melt running off that whole hillside at once could overwhelm it. And then you're not living in a house. You're living in a cistern." A third finger. "The roof. Those timbers are good. But timber under a constant load fails slowly, and then all at once, and it gives no warning when it goes. A wet snow on top of a heavy snow. A single timber with a hidden flaw, and 3 tons of earth come down on you in the dark. He lowered his hand. And the fourth thing is the simplest and the worst. You are alone. 3 miles from the nearest help with no neighbor who can see your chimney to know if your smoke has stopped. If you fall ill, if you're hurt, if anything at all goes wrong, there is no one. You will face it by yourself, or not at all. The room was quiet for a moment. The small fire ticked in the corner stove. A weaker design would have crumbled under that list. A weaker girl would have wept, or argued, or sent for her stepfather. Clara Voss did neither. She sat very still the way she always sat when she was thinking hard, and she went through the 4 dangers in her own mind, one at a time, the way she had been taught to go through everything. "The chimney," she said at last. "How would I know if it was starting to block before it was too late?" Ezra blinked. Of the 4 things he had named, that was the one he himself would have asked about first. He had expected fear from her. He had gotten engineering. "The flame," he said slowly. "Watch the flame. A clean draft pulls the fire bright and steady, and the smoke goes up easy. If the draft begins to fail, the fire will go sullen, lazy low, hard to start, slow to catch. The smoke will hang. You'll smell it in the room before anything worse can happen. If your fire ever starts to sulk for no reason you can find, you put it out, you open the door, and you do not light it again until you've cleared that tunnel, end to end." Clara nodded once and rose and crossed to the corner and crouched by the stove and looked at the angle where the pipe entered the clay-lined tunnel into the hill. She studied it a long moment. Then she took up a length of stiff wire she kept for clearing ash, and she ran it up into the throat of the pipe as far as it would reach, testing feeling, and she found a small ridge of cold, hardened clay near the bend that she did not like the feel of, and she worked it free. She did all of it without saying a word that same morning while the idea was fresh. Ezra Winthrop watched her do it, and he understood something then that he had not fully understood before. He had come out to that hillside 3 times now, believing in some private corner of his learned mind that he was the one bringing knowledge to the girl, that he was the natural philosopher and she was the clever amateur who had stumbled onto a sound principle by luck and inheritance. He saw now that it was not so. He had come to record her failure, and instead, without ever meaning to, he had handed her the one thing she had been missing. A list of the ways the design might kill her, and she had taken that list and turned it on the spot into the means of her own survival. She had not been frightened by his 4 dangers. She had been grateful for them. She had taken the warning of a man who half expected her to die and made it the reason she would live. He did not say any of that out loud, but he wrote it down that night in his leather notebook by the light of his own lamp in his own colder house. And the last line of the entry read, "She does not need to be taught. She needs only to be told the truth, and she will do the rest herself." It was around this time that the second skeptic made his quietest move. Conrad Felsner did not come to the hillside again. A proud craftsman does not return to the scene of his own wrong prediction. That is too much to ask of any man who has built his whole life on the belief that he knows how things are properly done. He went on telling whoever would listen that the girl would be dug out dead, come February ruined by damp or stopped by bad air. And he believed it mostly the way a man believes the thing. He needs to be true. But Conrad Felsner had a son, a boy of 14 named Anton, quiet and watchful with his father's careful hands, and as it would turn out, rather more than his father's open mind. And one cold morning, Conrad sent the boy down to the Voss claim to help with the chores. He framed it as charity, a neighborly thing. The girl was alone, he told his wife, and a strong young pair of hands would not go amiss in such weather. And besides, it was good for a boy to learn the duty a man owes to his struggling neighbors. All of that was said at the breakfast table in front of the family, and most of it was even true. But Clara understood the real purpose before Anton Felsner had finished stamping the snow off his boots at her door. The boy had been sent to watch, to see with his own eyes what made the dugout warm, to learn the trick of it and carry it home so that Conrad Felsner, who could not bring himself to ask a 16-year-old girl to teach him anything, might know what she knew without ever having to admit that he wished to. The father was too proud to learn, so he had sent his son to steal the knowledge and dress the theft up as kindness, and very likely told himself it was both. Clara could have turned the boy away. She could have given him only the dullest chores, kept him from the parts that mattered, sent him home knowing nothing. Another person might have. It would have been fair. She did the opposite. She brought Anton Felsner inside out of the cold, and she warmed him and she fed him, and then she taught him everything. Not the bare minimum, not the chores, everything. She showed him how the double wall worked and why the dead air between the walls mattered more than the thickness of either one. She showed him the angle of the chimney and explained how the draft pulled clean because of the slope and how the clay around the pipe drank the heat and gave it back to the earth. She showed him the grade of the floor and let him pour a cup of water in the back corner and watch it find its way to the door, and explained how a fall so small the eye could not see, it could still carry every drop of water away from where a person slept. She taught him more carefully than she taught anyone because she understood what he was, and she understood what it meant, because here was the truth that Clara Voss had carried with her since the cottonwoods, the truth her mother had carried before her. That knowledge is not a thing you win by hoarding. It is a thing you keep alive by giving it away. Her mother had not invented the principles of the dugout. She had gathered them from a French trapper, from a German journal, from the displaced people who had wintered in the earth before any of them arrived. She had been a link in a chain. And the only way a chain survives is if every link reaches forward to the next. Clara was not going to win her argument with Conrad Felsner by arguing. She had known that from the start. She was going to win it through his son, through a 14-year-old boy who would carry what she taught him forward into the years, into other walls, into other winters long after the pride of the fathers had turned to dust. She did not tell Anton that she knew why he had been sent. She did not need to. She simply taught him fully and well and let him carry it home. And in the giving of it freely to the son of a man who had called her a fool, Clara Voss did the most important thing she would do. That whole winter, though, none of them, not Conrad, not Anton, not Ezra, not Clara herself, fully understood it yet. Christmas came on a Monday that year. Clara spent it alone, and the truth of it was that aloneness suited her. A woman from the settlement, Mrs. Halverson, had traded her a small chicken some days before, and Clara cooked it slow in the corner stove and ate it at her small table with cornbread and the last of a jar of preserves another neighbor had pressed on her out of pity. Outside, the night had dropped to 20 below. Inside, the dugout held at 64 degrees easy and steady, while the wind walked the top of the hill and found no way in. She did not feel sorry for herself. That is the thing that would have surprised the three men had they been able to see her. They imagined her surely as a pitiful figure, a child cast out, huddled and lonely in a hole in the ground on the holiest night of the year. The Reverend especially would have pictured her so, because it suited the story he told about her. But Clara Voss was not pitiful that Christmas night, and she was not lonely in the way they imagined. She sat in the warmth her mother had designed and she herself had built, and she ate food she had earned, and she understood slowly turning it over, the way she turned over everything that she was, for the first time in her entire life, completely free. Not happy exactly. That was too simple a word, and Clara had never had much use for simple words. The freedom she felt was not the light, giddy freedom of a child let out of school. It was heavier than that and truer. It was the freedom of a person who answers to no one and is kept by no one and survives by no hand but her own. It was the freedom her mother had never had, Marta Voss, who had crossed an ocean alone and then spent 22 years married to the necessity of men, never once free, watching and waiting and saving egg money in the back of a Bible against the day her daughter might have the thing she herself never could. Clara understood that Christmas night exactly what her mother had given her. Not just the money, not just the notes, the whole of it. A way out that did not run through any man's house. A roof of her own. A life that was hers to keep or lose by her own hand. She took up her mother's Bible. She read a while by lamplight in the language her mother had spoken to her when she was small. And then she turned as she always did to the back pages, to the slanting, careful hand, and she read the last 3 lines, and for the first time, she did not read them as instruction. She read them as a gift handed across the dark from a woman who was gone. And she pressed her hand flat against the warm sod of the wall beside her, the way the others had pressed theirs, but for a different reason. The earth will hold you. I tested this myself. It held her that night. It would hold her through worse. The trader came back on the 26th of December. He was the same man who had stopped at her dugout once before, weeks earlier. A Yankee who had spent 20 years moving goods up and down the river settlements, and who had in that time learned to read the Dakota sky the way Clara read the land. He rode up in the gray afternoon, and he did not get down off his horse, and Clara could see from the set of his face that he had not come to trade. "There's weather coming," he said. "Bad weather. The worst I've seen in maybe 10 years, maybe more." He looked up at the sky, at the way the light lay at something in the air, that Clara could feel a little of herself now, but could not yet name. "It'll be on us inside of a day and a half. 36 hours, give or take. It'll drop to 40 below, maybe colder. And the wind." He shook his head. "The wind will be like nothing you've ever stood in." "I'll be ready," Clara said. "Girl." The trader's voice was not unkind, but it was hard the way a thing has to be hard to save a life. "This is not about pride. I know your story. The whole county knows your story by now, the girl who dug herself into the hill. And maybe you've proved your point, and good for you. But this is different. This storm is going to kill people. I have seen it before, and I am telling you, do not let it kill you to win an argument. Go to the settlement. Go to the established families. There is no shame in it. I have food, Clara said. I have water. I have fuel more than I need. And I have a house built to stand exactly this. She looked at him steadily. If I can't survive this storm here, then I couldn't survive it anywhere. And I would rather find that out in the place I built than in some other man's parlor. The trader looked at her a long moment. He looked at the thin, clean thread of smoke rising from the top of the hill. He looked at the low cottonwood door and the deep-set windows and the long mass of the hillside lying over it all. Your choice, he said at last. But I gave you fair warning. If they find you dead out here come the thaw that's on your head and not on mine. And he turned his horse and he rode north toward the settlement to carry his warning to people who would listen to it. And Clara watched him go. Then she went inside and she took inventory slow and careful, the way her mother would have. 37 pounds of cornmeal, 43 pounds of salt pork, 28 pounds of dried beans, 12 pounds of rice, 6 pounds of coffee, 3 gallons of kerosene for the lamp and the small comfort of its warmth, 58 pounds of winter squash stored in the small cellar hole she had dug into the hill behind the dugout, 4 chickens still laying even in the cold, kept in a snug pen against the back wall, 18 gallons of water in barrels by the door, and wood nearly 3/4 of a cord left dry and split and stacked far more than any storm should need. She was ready. She had been ready in truth since the cottonwoods. The storm coming down out of Canada was only the final examination of a thing her mother had begun preparing for years before, in stolen moments in a hand grown slow with dying. That evening, while Clara sat checking her stores by lamplight 3 miles south, a different kind of reckoning was taking place in the white-painted house on the open prairie. Reverend Whitmore's wife, Eleanor, was a quiet woman who had followed her husband west out of duty and had spent every winter since wishing she had not. She was not a builder nor a thinker of Clara's kind, but she was kind in the plain, unshowy way of a woman who notices who is cold and who is hungry. And across the past weeks, without ever once mentioning it to her husband, Eleanor Whitmore had walked or sent bread down to the Voss claim 3 separate times. A loaf here, a jar of preserves there. Small things. The things a woman gives another woman she fears the world has forgotten. That evening, with the trader's warning fresh through the settlement and the great storm gathering, she told her husband what she had done. The Reverend's first response was anger. Of course it was. He had pronounced his judgment on the girl in the hillside, and to learn that his own wife had been quietly defying that judgment for weeks struck at something tender in his pride. He began to speak sharply. He drew the breath to deliver a sermon, and then he stopped. He stopped because Eleanor was looking at him not defiantly but steadily with the face of a woman who has done a small good thing and is not sorry for it. And he stopped because somewhere underneath the pride and the Boston certainties and the long habit of being the man who knew how things were properly done, Reverend Whitmore was not in fact a bad man. He was a wrong man often, a vain one sometimes, but not at the bottom a cruel one. He did not finish the sermon. He turned away from his wife, and he went into the cold front room of his cold, beautiful house, and he knelt down alone in the dark. and the Reverend Whitmore, who had told Clara Voss to her face that nature would not permit what she was attempting, that she would be gone by spring, that she had turned her back on Christian society. That same man knelt on the freezing floorboards of his own failing house and prayed quietly where no one could hear him for the safety of the girl in the hillside. He would not have admitted it. Not the next morning, not for a long time after. The crack in a proud man's armor opens slowly, and in the dark, and it is the last thing he will ever confess to. But it had opened. Eleanor's 3 loaves of bread had done what no argument ever could, and the storm had not even arrived yet. It arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 29th of December, but it came early. The trader had said 36 hours. He had read the sky as well as any man alive could read it, and he had still been wrong, not because his eye had failed him, but because the prairie keeps its own counsel and does not consult the experts. The storm that he had said would arrive on the morning of the 28th came instead in the black middle of the night, before it a full 18 hours ahead of his reckoning. And on the evening of the 27th, in the last quiet hours before it broke, Clara Voss discovered that her mother's design had one flaw left in it that no one had warned her of, not even Ezra. She had gone out at dusk to bring in a final armload of wood and to check the chimney one last time before the weather closed in. And on her way back to the door, half by instinct, she crouched at the low corner of the entrance where the floor's grade carried its drainage out into the ground, the one place where the inside of her home met the outside where water was meant to leave. It was choked with ice. The day's small thaw, brief and partial, had let a little meltwater run toward the drain, and then the cold had clamped down again and caught it there, and frozen it, and built on it until a ridge of hard gray ice had grown across the very channel that was meant to carry water away. If the storm came and the wind drove snow against the entrance and the warmth of the dugout melted it, and that meltwater had nowhere to go because the drain was sealed with ice, then Conrad Felsner's prophecy would come true after all. Not by damp, not by bad air, by a frozen drain and a flooding floor, the one thing none of them, not even she, had thought to fear. Clara knelt in the gathering dark in the deepening cold, the temperature already past 15 below, and the first hard edge of the storm wind beginning to moan along the hill, and she set to clearing it. She had no tool that would serve. The wire was too thin, the axe too blunt and brutal for the close, careful work the channel needed. So she did it with her hands. She pulled off her mittens because she could not feel the ice through them, and she worked the frozen ridge loose with her bare fingers, and a short length of split kindling in the dark alone. While the wind rose around her and the cold bit into her hands, until she could not feel them at all. There was no one to help her, no neighbor to see her chimney, no mother to tell her what to do. 3 miles of frozen prairie lay between Clara Voss and the nearest living soul, exactly as Ezra had warned her, and the great storm was coming down the sky to meet her, and the only hands on that hillside were her own. She cleared the drain. It took the better part of an hour. When it was done, her fingers were white and numb and would ache for 2 days after. But the channel ran clear. She poured a cup of water into the back corner and watched it find its way down the long, imperceptible grade and out through the open drain and into the waiting earth exactly as it was meant to. And only then did she go inside and close the 4-inch cottonwood door against the rising dark and warm. her ruined hands at the small, steady fire. It was the only moment that whole winter that Clara Voss truly faced the possibility that she had calculated something wrong. And she had faced it the way she faced everything. Not with panic, not with prayer, but with her own two hands and the patient, stubborn refusal to let a thing beat her that she could still fix. The storm hit at 2 o'clock that morning. She woke to a sound that did not sound like wind. It sounded like a train, like 100 trains, like the earth itself had opened its throat and was screaming across the prairie above her head. The whole hill seemed to shudder with it. Fine dust sifted down between the roof sods and drifted in the lamplight. The cottonwood door pressed and groaned against its leather hinges, but the walls held, the timbers held, the door held. Clara lit the lamp and she lit the corner stove, and she looked at the thermometer near the door. The wind, finding every microscopic seam, pulling the heat out faster than the still earth could replace it, had dragged the inside temperature down to 54 degrees. She fed the fire patient and unhurried and watched the needle climb back towards 60. Then she looked at the thermometer that hung outside just past the door, and through the small, deep-set window she could read it by the lamp. 31 degrees below zero, and it was still falling. Clara Voss sat down at her small wooden table in the warm heart of the hill her mother had designed, and she had built. And she opened the small notebook she kept beside the Bible, and she dipped her pen, and in a steady hand that did not shake despite everything, despite the ruined fingers in the screaming dark and the great cold reaching down for her, she wrote 4 words, Hour 1, still holding. Then she set down the pen, and she waited while the worst storm in 10 years closed its fist around the prairie, and 4 people 3 miles north began, though none of them knew it yet, to die. The storm held the prairie in its fist for 3 days and 3 nights. There is no good way to describe what that was for a person who has never stood inside it. The wind did not gust and fall the way ordinary wind does. It simply blew without pause, without mercy, a single unbroken roar that went on for 72 hours until the people caught in it began to forget that the world had ever held any other sound. The snow did not fall so much as it traveled sideways in a blinding horizontal river that erased the line between earth and sky until a man could not tell, up from down, could not see his own hand at the end of his own arm, could not find a barn 40 feet from his own door, and the cold went down and down and down past anything the settlement had a memory of until it reached 42 degrees below zero and sat there patient as the grave. Above the hillside 3 miles south of Yankton, the storm screamed its worst. And 6 feet beneath it, Clara Voss read a book. That is the whole truth of it. And it is the most extraordinary thing in this entire story. While the worst weather in a decade tried to scour the prairie clean of every living thing upon it, a 16-year-old girl sat at a small wooden table in 56 degrees of steady warmth, and read and cooked and slept and rose every 6 hours to record the temperature in her notebook in a hand that never once shook. The wind that was killing men 3 miles away was to Clara only a sound. A great and terrible sound, yes, but a sound that was happening to someone else somewhere else on the far side of 3 tons of earth, that did not care how hard the wind blew, because the earth had stood through 10,000 winters worse than this one, and felt none of them. Hour 1, Still holding, she had written. And at hour 7 and hour 13 and hour 19 and on, through the long roaring dark, the entries continued even and unbroken. 56 degrees. 56. 56. The needle did not move. The earth held its temperature the way it had held it since before there were any people to measure it, and Clara had known enough, and her mother had known enough, to climb down inside that great patient stillness and let it keep them both. 3 miles north, it was a different world. In Arvid Ness's timber house, the north wall began to fail on the second night. The wind found a weakness in the boards and worked at it the way wind always works, patiently, endlessly. And at last it tore 3 planks free and flung them away into the white, and the cold came pouring in through the gap like water through a breached dam. Arvid nailed boards across it from the inside, working in a gale that had invaded his own front room, his fingers too numb to hold the nails. He had long since burned through his split wood. By the second night he was burning furniture chairs first, then a table his wife had carried from Minnesota, then the very boards he pried from the interior walls. His family survived. Barely. They survived because Arvid Ness was a strong and stubborn man who would not let them die, and because the storm in the end decided not to take them. But it was a near thing, and he knew it was a near thing, and he would carry the knowledge of how near it had been for the rest of his life. In Conrad Felsner's stone house, the master mason's beautiful walls did exactly what cold stone does. And they did it without pity. The dense, square, true-laid stone drank the warmth out of every room as fast as the family's fire could make it, and gave back nothing but a deep and bitter chill that seemed to live inside the very rock. His 6-year-old daughter, the small, pale girl who had slept in her coat and boots for 2 weeks, already took the worst of it. By the third morning, 2 of the toes on her right foot had gone gray and waxen and would not warm no matter what her mother did. And Conrad Felsner, the man who had served 4 years to learn to build true, the man who had told a 16-year-old girl that pride comes before the fall, knelt on the cold floor of his fine stone house and chafed his daughter's frozen foot between his big, careful hands, and understood at last what kind of house he had built. In Reverend Whitmore's white-painted house, the one that announced civilization to the empty prairie, Eleanor, Whitmore went into convulsions on the second night. The cold reached so deep into her that her body began to shake and would not stop. And her husband wrapped her in every blanket and every coat and every stitch of cloth they owned, and held her and prayed over her in a room where his own breath hung white in the lamplight. She lived. The dawn came and the third day, and she lived. But the Reverend had spent that whole long night believing she would not, holding his wife's shaking body in a house he had built to be admired. And there are lessons a man learns in such a night that no amount of pride can ever fully bury again. And out in the wider settlement beyond the 3 men of this story, the storm took its 4. 2 old men brothers who had run out of wood on the second night and had no strength left to fetch more, and simply lay down together and did not get up. A young married couple newly arrived who saw a lull in the wind on the 3rd afternoon and stepped out to bring in fuel, and lost the line between their woodpile and their door in the white, and wandered and froze 50 yards from a warmth they never found again. And an infant 9 months old, whose mother held him against her own body all through the storm, and could not, with all the love in the world, make her own warmth enough to fill a drafty claim shack in 40 below. They died because their houses could not hold them. That is the plain and terrible truth of it. They were not weak, and they were not foolish, and most of them were not even unprepared by the ordinary standards of that hard country. They died because the standard way of building a home on that prairie, 4 walls standing free and proud against the open sky, fighting the cold with fire and stubbornness, was a way of building that the prairie could defeat. And on the 29th of December, 1876, the prairie defeated it 4 times over. On the morning of the second day, while the storm still raged at its full and killing height, someone pounded on Clara Voss's door. She had been at the table recording the temperature. The pounding came hard and irregular over the roar of the wind, a fist striking the 4-inch cottonwood, and for a moment Clara could not be certain she had heard it at all. Then it came again, and she crossed the small room and braced herself and pulled the heavy door inward against the storm. Arvid Ness stood in the white. He was barely recognizable. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His face was the gray-white of a man who has been too long in killing cold, and the wind drove the snow sideways past him, so that he seemed to stand at the center of a world that was tearing itself apart. He had followed the line of the creek bed 3 miles south, through a blizzard that had already killed 4 people. And he had done it for a reason that cost a man like him more than the journey itself. "My daughter," he said. The wind tore the words half away. "The little one. She is bad. The cold is in her and—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "We are out of wood. We have burned everything. The furniture, the walls. There is nothing left to burn. And she is bad, and I did not know where else." He did not finish. He could not. Because to finish was to say the rest of it out loud, that he, Arvid Ness, 42 years old, 3 years on the Dakota prairie, the man who had stood on this very hillside and told this very girl that she would freeze like a potato in a cellar, had come 3 miles through a deadly storm to beg help from a 16-year-old he had called a fool. He could not say it. So he stood in the doorway with the ice in his beard and the white roaring behind him, and he let the unfinished sentence hang, and he waited. Clara did not make him say it. She understood the language of men like Arvid Ness, had understood it her whole life, watching her stepfather, watching the men of the settlements, watching how a certain kind of man would rather die than ask, and how the asking, when it finally came, cost him everything he had. She did not make him pay any more than he was already paying. She turned and she went to her woodpile, and she filled a grain sack with split dry wood, a good portion of it more than she could easily spare enough to carry a family through the rest of the storm, if they were careful. And then she did the more important thing. She knelt beside him at the door in the cold pouring in, and she told him fast and clear over the wind exactly how to use it, not to build it high, not to roar a great fire that would burn through the wood in hours and warm only the air. She told him to build it small and feed it slow and put the child close and wrap her with him and use the warmth of their own bodies and the smallest steady flame to hold the little one through. She told him how to make a little wood do the work of much. She gave him in 2 cold minutes, at a storm-blasted door, the same principle her mother had spent 12 years gathering, that you do not fight the cold by burning everything you have. You outlast it by understanding how warmth truly works. Arvid Ness took the sack of wood. He looked at her, and there was something in his ravaged face that he could not have named and would never have spoken. He did not say thank you. He gave one short, hard nod, the nod of a man acknowledging a debt too large for words. And then he turned and he bent into the wind, and he was gone into the white, following the creek bed back north, 3 miles to his freezing house and his failing child. Clara closed the door against the storm, and she went back to her table, and she picked up her pen, and after a moment she wrote a single line beneath the temperature. A came, took wood, showed him how. His girl is bad. God keep her. It was the only prayer Clara Voss wrote down that whole winter, and she did not write it for herself. The wind stopped on the morning of the 4th day. It did not fade. It did not taper. It simply stopped the way the worst storms always stop, all at once, between one moment and the next, leaving behind a silence so total and so strange that the ear kept hunting for the roar long after it was gone. Clara woke into that silence the way a person wakes when a great noise that has filled the world for 3 days suddenly ceases. And for a moment she did not understand what had changed. Then she rose and she went to the door and she pushed it open into a world made new. The drifts stood 8 feet high, 10 in places, sculpted by the wind into long, smooth ridges that gleamed under a sky scrub pale and cloudless. The thermometer by the door read 42 degrees below zero, the coldest reading of the whole storm, as the worst cold so often comes in the dead, clear calm after the wind. And the whole frozen prairie lay still and white and silent under the hard winter sun. Beautiful and terrible the way the things that nearly kill us are so often beautiful afterward. Inside Clara's dugout, the thermometer read 56 degrees. She built up her fire and watched the needle climb past 60 towards 64. And then she dressed in everything warm she owned, and she took stock of what the storm had left her. Her stores were nearly untouched. Her wood, even after the sack she had given Arvid, would carry her well past the spring. Her chickens had survived in their snug pen against the back wall. The roof had held. The walls had held. The drain she had cleared with her bare hands on the last evening before the storm had carried away every drop of meltwater exactly as it was built to. She had come through the worst storm in 10 years without a scratch. And then Clara Voss did the thing that, more than the surviving, more than the building, more than any single thing, she did that whole winter would change how the settlement saw her forever. She did not go to town to be congratulated. She did not wait for the established families to come and marvel at her dugout and admit that they had been wrong. She loaded a sled with food, with cornmeal and salt pork and beans and squash, with more than she could comfortably give, and she set out alone across the frozen drifts to the houses of the people who had called her a fool. She went to Arvid Ness's house first. She found a family that had barely survived. The north wall patched with the interior boards Arvid had torn down. The furniture gone for fuel. The little girl alive, the small wood used the way Clara had told him to use it, had held her through the last terrible night, but with 2 gray toes on her right foot that the family would watch and worry over for weeks, and that she would in the end lose. Arvid met Clara at the door, and he did not have the words, and Clara did not require any. She brought the food inside. She set it down. And she said, the only thing she said in any of the houses she visited that day, "What do you need?" Not, "I told you so," not, Do you believe me now? Not a single word about the dugout, or the cold, or the argument she had so completely and so visibly won. Just 3 words offered plainly from a girl with a sled of food to a family that had nearly died. What do you need? That was the thing that broke them. Not her survival could be explained away, attributed to luck, to youth, to the favor of a God who looks after fools and children. But this open-handed kindness offered without triumph by the very girl they had mocked, to the very men who had mocked her. There is no defense against that. A person can armor himself against an enemy's victory. He cannot armor himself against his enemy's mercy. It goes straight through. She went on to the Felsner house and set down food and asked what they needed. She went to the Whitmore house where Eleanor was still weak and wrapped in blankets, but alive, and set down food and asked what they needed. House by house across the frozen settlement, Clara Voss carried her sled, and at every door she set down what she had and asked the same 3 words. And at every door the same thing happened quietly, invisibly in the hearts of people who had been certain they understood the order of the world. When they asked her, and they all asked her eventually, unable to help themselves, how she had done it. How she had survived the storm that killed 4 others alone in a hole in the ground on 6 pounds of wood a day. When they asked, Clara Voss did not lecture them. She did not explain thermal mass or dead air, or the angle of a chimney or the grade of a floor. She did not say a single word about engineering, though she understood it better than any of them. She said only this: the earth held. 3 words again. The same plain economy. And those 3 words traveled across that settlement faster and further than any explanation ever could have. The earth held. They passed from house to house, mother to mother, man to man, carrying with them not a technical principle, but a kind of revelation that the cold ground these people had spent their whole lives fighting, fearing, building up away from, was not their enemy after all. That the very earth beneath their feet, the earth that grew their grain and buried their dead, would also, if they understood it, shelter the living. The girl had not beaten the prairie. She had stopped fighting it. She had climbed down inside it and let it keep her. The earth held. It became the truest thing anyone in that settlement had heard all winter. Ezra Winthrop came on the 4th day, the same day Clara made her rounds, and when he saw what she had built and how it had held, he understood that his role had changed. He was no longer a curious observer documenting an experiment that might fail. He was the witness to something that needed to be told. He spent 3 hours in the dugout with his leather notebook, and he measured everything: wall thickness, roof angle, floor grade, chimney placement and length and angle, wood consumption set against the consumption of the timber and stone houses, temperature stability hour by hour through the worst storm in a decade. 18 pages of notes, dense and precise, the work of a man trained to ask how a thing works, and now finally in possession of an answer worth recording. "You've proven something," he said when he had filled his pages. He set down his pencil and looked at her across the small table. "Not survived. Proven. There's a difference, and it matters. A family could build one of these for 1/3 of what a timber house costs. It would burn 1/5 of the fuel. The children would not freeze in it. And it's made of earth and sod, and a little timber materials that cost almost nothing but the labor of cutting them. He shook his head slowly. 4 people died this week 3 miles from where you sat reading a book in 56 degrees. They did not have to die. That's what you've proven, that they did not have to die. So I got lucky, Clara said. She was testing him. She did that sometimes to people she had begun to trust, offered them the easy wrong answer to see whether they would take it. No, Ezra did not take it. Luck is random. This is engineering. There is a man in Germany who has spent his life writing the mathematics of what you did with your hands in a hillside, and I'm going to write to the territorial newspaper, because what you have done here needs to be shared. People need to know this is possible. They need to know before next winter. The article ran in the Dakota Free Press on the 18th of January, 1877. A thermally efficient dwelling for prairie settlement. That was the title, dry, precise, scientific, with no sentiment in it at all, which was exactly as Clara would have wanted it. The piece laid out the temperature, comparisons, the wood consumption rates, the construction costs, the principles of thermal mass and dead air insulation, and natural draft ventilation. All of it set down in Ezra Winthrop's careful, measured prose. And in the entire article, there was not one word about the age or the sex or the circumstances of the person who had built the thing. Ezra had done that on purpose, and he had told Clara he was going to do it. And she had agreed. The article referred throughout only to the builder at the Voss claim, so that when the letters began to come and the visitors began to ride out from across the territory to see this miraculous warm house with their own eyes, they came expecting to meet an engineer, a man of learning, a builder of reputation. And what they found standing at the low cottonwood door of a dugout in a south-facing hillside was a 16-year-old girl. Reverend Whitmore left for Massachusetts in the spring of 1878. He had decided over the course of that hard winter that the frontier was not, after all, the place he had imagined it to be when he set out to bring civilization to it. Perhaps he had learned that civilization was not a thing one brings in a white-painted house from somewhere else. Perhaps he had simply grown tired and cold and old. The story does not record his private reasons, and it does not matter. But before he left, he rode out one last time to the Voss claim. And he did a thing that cost a proud and learned man a great deal. He stood at the low door of the dugout. He did not go in. He never did go in. That final humility was beyond him, and he held his hands behind his back the way he always had. And he looked at Clara Voss, who was 20 months past the morning he had told her that nature would not permit her to survive. "I told you that this was not appropriate," he said. "Do you remember I told you a young woman could not live alone in a hole in the ground? That it announced nothing but desperation." He paused, and something moved across his face, some old certainty finally giving way. "I was wrong about what appropriate means out here. I thought you were being foolish. I did not understand that you were being wise. There were families this winter that are whole that still have all their children because of what you built and what you taught. That is not foolishness. That is the most appropriate thing I have seen since I came to this country." And then he took from his coat a sealed envelope, and he held it out to her. Inside, when she opened it later, Clara found letters of introduction, 3 of them addressed to newspaper editors in 3 different states. each one signed in the Reverend's own careful hand, each one describing the dwelling at the Voss claim as an engineering achievement worthy of documentation and study, and commending its builder to the attention of any man of science who might read it. He had written them himself, a Boston man, a man of God, a man who had built his whole identity on knowing how things were properly done, sitting down at his desk in his failing White House and composing in his own hand a testament to the genius of the 16-year-old girl he had once tried to talk out of her own salvation. He did not apologize in words beyond what he had said at the door. Men like Reverend Whitmore do not apologize in words. The words are too small to carry the weight, and the pride will not let them through. But he apologized in the way such men do when they truly mean it, in ink and indeed in 3 letters that would open doors for Clara Voss across half the frontier. It was the most a man of his kind had to give, and he gave all of it. Then he climbed onto his horse and he rode east toward Massachusetts, and Clara Voss watched the white-painted figure dwindle down the road toward town. For the second and last time, the way she had watched him ride away in the autumn. But it was a different watching now, and they both knew it. The change spread outward from that winter, the way warmth spreads outward from a banked fire, slowly, steadily into the cold around it. Arvid Ness rebuilt in the spring of 1877. He did not build another timber house standing proud and free against the open sky. He dug. He set his new house 2 feet down into the ground and banked the earth up high against 3 of its walls, and he angled the back of it into a low rise, the way his grandfather had done in Norway, the way he had remembered too late standing in the warm heart of Clara's dugout in the December cold. He cut his wood consumption by half. His family never spent another winter in their coats. And for a long while, he never told a soul where the idea had come from. Because the pride of a man like Arvid Ness is a slow thing to heal. But it healed. It happened at a settlement gathering in the high summer of 1877, when the worst of that winter had become a story people told. Someone asked Arvid, half joking, how he had come to build his strange new half-buried house, and whether he had taken to living like a badger. And there were men around to hear it. And there was a chance in that moment for Arvid to laugh it off, to claim the idea as his own, to let the question pass. He did not let it pass. I learned it from the Voss girl, Arvid Ness said, plainly, in front of all of them. She knew something the rest of us had forgotten. My family is warm this year, because a 16-year-old girl knew more than I did, and was kind enough to teach me, even after I called her a fool to her face. He looked around at the men gathered there, at all the established homesteaders who had given Clara 2 weeks before she came crawling back. There is no shame in learning from the one who knows. The shame is in being too proud to learn, and freezing your children to keep your pride. I nearly learned that one too late. It was the longest speech anyone had ever heard Arvid Ness make, and it settled the matter in that settlement for good. Conrad Felsner never made a speech. That was not his way. But the master mason added an interior wall to his beautiful stone house that summer, with a gap of dead air between it and the cold outer stone, and the moisture that had wept down his walls. Every winter morning stopped, and his rooms grew warmer on less wood. And when a neighbor asked him where he had gotten the notion, Conrad, to his credit for it, cost him something too, said that he had gotten it from the dwelling at the Voss claim, and that the girl who built it had understood a principle that he, with 4 years of apprenticeship and a master's papers from Hamburg, had not. And his son, his quiet, watchful son Anton, the boy he had sent down the hill to learn the girl's secrets and steal them home. Anton Felsner carried what Clara had taught him forward into his whole life. He grew up to be the finest builder in that part of the territory, better than his father in the end, because he had learned young to combine his father's old-world precision with the new understanding Clara had given him freely, in a warm dugout more carefully than she taught anyone, because she had known exactly what he was and exactly what it meant. The chain her mother had forged held. The link reached forward. The knowledge stayed alive. That is the thing the established men never quite understood about what happened that winter, even after they had rebuilt their houses and admitted their errors and learned to say her name with respect. They thought the story was about a girl who survived a storm. They thought it was about toughness or stubbornness or the favor of God toward the desperate. It was about none of those things. It was about a woman who had crossed an ocean alone and spent 22 years trapped in the necessity of men, and who had used the last of her dying months to write down in the back of a Bible, in a slow and careful hand, everything she had gathered across a lifetime of watching so that her daughter would have the one thing she herself had never been allowed to have. A way out that ran through no man's house, a roof of her own, a life that was hers to keep by her own hand and her own mind. It was about a 16-year-old girl who had been thrown out into the start of a Dakota winter with nothing and who had not panicked and had not begged and had not gone crawling back, but had instead read the land the way her mother taught her and built the thing her mother designed, and outlasted the worst storm in 10 years on 6 pounds of wood a day, and then carried food to the houses of the men who had mocked her and asked them plainly what they needed. It was about the difference between knowing how a thing is done and knowing how a thing works. The men of that settlement had known how houses were done. Clara Voss had known how warmth works and where it goes and why, and that knowledge, gathered by a dead woman and proven by a living girl, saved more lives in the end than all the timber and stone and master's papers on the whole frozen prairie. By the year 1880, Clara Voss had proven up her homestead and filed besides for a timber claim and consulted on 43 earth-sheltered dwellings across Dakota Territory and into Nebraska and Montana. By the most conservative reckoning anyone could make, 61 people were alive who would otherwise have died of cold, of fuel shortage, of the simple failure of a house standing proud and free against a prairie that did not forgive such pride. 61 lives, people who would have frozen in timber boxes and stone tombs alive instead in the warmth of the earth, because a girl had been thrown out of a house with nothing but her mother's Bible and had been wise enough to read what was written in the back of it. She was 20 years old. She married Ezra Winthrop in June of that year. It was both of them would have told you a practical decision before it was anything else. Two people who respected each other's minds, who worked well together, who shared a purpose. They wanted to document the old ways of building the borrowed wisdom of trappers and immigrants, and the displaced people who had wintered in the earth before all of it was lost, beneath the rising tide of sawn lumber and cast iron stoves, and the modern certainty that newer always meant better. They built a larger home into the hillside on Clara's claim, 3 rooms with skylights for the long winter dark. and a ventilation system Ezra had adapted from the principles of mine engineering. They lived in it for 47 years. They raised 4 children in it, all of them healthy. None of them ever once cold in a Dakota winter. And together they documented 87 earth-sheltered dwellings across the northern plains, proving slowly, decade by decade, that the old ways were not primitive at all, that they were sophisticated answers refined across centuries to genuine and deadly problems, that a thing can be old and still be wiser than everything that came after it. Clara Voss died in 1927. She was 67 years old. The territorial papers, by then long since states, called her an architect and an engineer, though she had never studied either one in any school. She had never needed to. She had understood thermodynamics before she ever heard the word. She had understood physics before she ever saw the formulas. She had understood from the very beginning the one thing that all the learned and established men around her had forgotten, that nature is not an enemy to be fought, but a system to be understood and worked alongside. In the December of the year, she died in the original dugout. The first one, the one she had built with her own hands and 2 Norwegian farm boys at the age of 16. The one that still stood and was still lived in by her youngest daughter. The inside temperature held at 53 degrees, while the air outside the door read 8 below. 51 years. 51 years of stable earth-given warmth in a structure that had cost $27 to build, designed by a woman who never lived to see it finished, and built by a girl the whole county had given 2 weeks to live. On the last evening of her life in the larger house up the slope, Clara Voss called her youngest daughter to her, and she took up her mother's Bible. Marta's Bible, the battered Swedish edition, with the cracked spine and the pressed flowers from 3 countries. The same Bible Clara had carried out of her stepfather's house at 9:30 on a gray November morning more than 50 years before. She had added to it across the long span of her life. The back pages that had once held only Marta's 14 pages of careful notes now held Clara's own decades of observation, of refinement of everything she had learned in 47 years of building into the earth. A whole life's worth of knowledge set down in a slanting hand that near the end had grown slow and careful, in the very way her mother's had all those years ago, when Marta knew she was running out of time. Clara pressed the Bible into her daughter's hands. She did not give a speech. She had never been one for speeches. 3 words had always been enough for her. She simply closed her daughter's fingers around the worn leather cover, the way her own mother had, in a manner of speaking, closed Clara's fingers around it from beyond the grave on a cold afternoon behind a stand of cottonwoods. And the circle closed. Mother to daughter, knowledge gathered in secret, given in love, proven in fire and cold and storm, and passed forward again into hands that would carry it on, the same way it had always traveled since long before any of them came to that prairie. A French trapper to a Swedish woman to her daughter, a daughter to the next, each link, reaching forward to the next, because that is the only way that knowledge survives, not by hoarding, not by pride, by giving it away to someone who will need it on the day they need it most. There is a marker now on that hillside south of Yankton. It notes that this is the place where earth-sheltered construction was carried into the settlement of the northern plains, a system that combined the wisdom of Swedish cellars and German storm shelters and Norwegian storehouses, and the earth lodges of the people who had wintered there first, all of it gathered and proven and handed down by two women who never studied building in any school, and who understood it better than the men who had. The original dugout finally fell in upon itself sometime in the 1940s, but its foundations are there still if you know where to look. Cut into earth that has held steady at 52 degrees for more than a century through every storm and every winter and every killing cold, the prairie has thrown at it since. The earth held her. It is holding still.